The Breakfast Club with Keith D'Souza.
Yes, indeed, this is The Breakfast Club on 938 Now. Julian de Salisbury, he's the managing director and founder of Galen Growth Asia. Did I get your name right? Always get people's names wrong.
It's a tricky one, Keith.
Yeah.
It's French, so it's de Salaberry.
Oh, my
But
goodness.
We'll go with Julian this morning if you'd like.
Julian de Salisbury. Is that right?
Close.
Oh, that's close, not close enough. But we are talking about the business of health tech this morning. Everybody seems to be gravitating to Asia these days in the hopes of starting up companies. Is this different for the healthcare industry, or especially health tech?
No, I mean, it depends what you mean by gravitating, but it certainly Asia represents a very large segment of population around the world with a number of strong issues that need to be resolved, and therefore represents a significant opportunity for innovators with new technologies, or investors trying to place a bet, or providers of healthcare trying to bring better solutions to patients, for example.
I neglected to say that Julian is in town because he's organizing, or his organization, Galen Growth Asia, is organizing the HealthTech CEO Summit, which is taking place on the 17th of November. What kinds of companies are you looking at, or what kinds of companies are participating in this particular summit?
The focus of our HealthTech CEO Summit is deliberately, as its title says,
Right.
and that is to regroup the most promising health tech startups in the region,
Right.
And more importantly, their CEOs or founders into one room so that we can have this dialogue around the health system issues or inefficiencies or pain points, are various terms for it. And how do we solve those using technology? We wrap around these 50 startups, various representatives of stakeholder groups that are important to the ecosystem. So clinicians, large corporates, both those that are already in healthcare, but the new entrants such as, for example, Apple and Google, etc.
What is the share with Apple and Google designer making humans?
Well, I suspect that Google may be looking at some of this for
Indeed.
some of their more, let's say, less public type of areas of investment. I think Apple and Google realize that they have a very unique advantage in relation to their reach to the everyday person, and therefore can play a role in improving healthcare. A lot of healthcare can be improved by leveraging data better. Rather than necessarily just trying to find cures, we can try and, for example, make people more aware of disease and take action around the disease so as to prevent disease, for example.
We talked about, when we talk about health, that would gravitate to somebody's mind. Immediately is healthcare, new discoveries. But when we talk about health tech, is it perhaps to aid the health care systems in the region along? And what spectrum of startups are we looking at?
Yeah, so Galen Growth Asia was specifically set up by a very small number of health tech innovators who concluded that one of the reasons why Silicon Valley is so successful is because over a number of decades, the fluidity of information, of dialogue, of interaction between the various stakeholder groups makes it the success that it is. And so we decided that we needed something similar within health tech in Asia Pacific. And why? Largely because we believe that health tech, and we can talk about what health tech is in 2 seconds, represents an unprecedented, really, opportunity to transform healthcare, whether you're talking about a very mature healthcare system such as Singapore or Japan, or a very developing system such as, say, India or Indonesia. Now, health tech, a bit like everyday life, is changing for us because of technology. I can order a cab now on the phone whilst I'm doing something else. We're seeing the same phenomena go on in health tech.
Disruption?
Yeah, in some cases, clearly disruption. In other cases, it's literally just an evolution, but an accelerated evolution. So, if you look at some of the countries neighboring Singapore, a lot of the population don't have easy access to a healthcare professional. Technology now makes that a reality. So things that we take for granted, such as Skype, become a very realistic proposition in terms of connecting a patient with a healthcare professional, where the physician is in a city, but the patient could be in a remote area of that country.
I'm fascinated every day with the technology that's available these days. It seems so Star Trek-ish. If you were talking about looking at someone in a hologram and using a tricorder to scan his, well, that is just the extreme, but I don't think that's far away.
No, all those things. Well, holograms, I'm not sure yet.
But the real person,
the
yes.
tricorder is that we're all familiar with from Star Trek. Is not that far away, I believe. There are already one or two variants of it. They're not as advanced as the one in Star Trek, but they're getting there. So yes, the miniaturization of technology, be it a sensor, the improvement of battery life, for example, are all making those type of products, I guess, a reality. And so that's what we're seeing come through from a lot of the entrepreneurs that we interact with on a day-to-day basis throughout the year. But more importantly, those 50 promising ones that are turning up tomorrow for the HealthTech CEO Summit. Each of them are bringing their own solution to the Asia Pacific market as a whole. Let's say it varies on what their point of sale is.
Are they finding difficulty in funding their innovations?
Yes. I mean, it's fair to say that Asia Pacific, from a funding perspective, particularly within the health tech space, is not as abundant as it is in the US at the moment. But we shouldn't underestimate what is actually happening too. So one of the things that we have done at Galen Growth Asia is spend a little time understanding who's who in the zoo, but also what's happening from a funding perspective. What we discovered in the past 18 months is that there are in fact some 3,000 plus health tech new ventures, to use a term rather than the word startup, across the whole region. So I'm talking from India on one side to China on the other, from Japan to the north, to Australia to the south. There are some 3,000 plus ventures that are focused deliberately on health tech. They have attracted $2.5 billion of US dollars, that is, of funding during 2016 alone, and we expect that to be exceeded again in 2017. So it's not as if it's not happening, it is happening. But to answer your question more precisely, there are life cycles of investment in startups, and it's fair to say that the stage that sees you step out of the prototype into growth, which is commonly known as the more Series A type investment stage, is where there is a weakness in the system. And so this evening, for example, we are running a specific event focused on investment in health tech, where we regrouped all of the investors in the region, as many as we could, obviously, into one room, in order to try and demystify the value of health tech and how you make a sound investment in health tech.
When you talk about demystification, is the Asian venture capitalist uninformed? Is that why they're not willing to put their money where people's mouths are?
I think there's a couple of things that are driving that. It's not reticence as such as, I guess, is timidity, let's call it that. And one is, you're right, you get the investor that's been invested in other types of fields, say fintech or edtech, and therefore doesn't understand the space at all.
I can touch, see and feel the money that comes in that will be generated.
Correct, and I read an awful lot of stuff in the press, such as what Apple's doing with the watch, etc. But what does it actually mean, and how do I get into that? And then you get the investor that has invested, but is somewhat concerned around, say, the regulatory environment. In health, of course, it's highly regulated. People's lives are at stake, and therefore it has to be regulated. And health tech is a reasonably new space where regulations are not always defined properly yet.
And there's a whole lot more we want to speak to Julian about. We are running out of time for this segment of the Breakfast Club. When we come back, Julian talked about inefficiencies in the healthcare system. How would this particular field of health tech help to address that? We are speaking this morning with Julian de Salisbury. He is the managing director and founder of Galen Growth Asia. He is man behind the HealthTech CEO Summit, which is happening this Friday, which is bringing together 50 of the most prominent health tech startups across the region, along with investors and key stakeholders, to build an ecosystem that can solve real-world problems. What's being solved, and how are they doing it? Keep it right here on The Breakfast Club. We'll be back after an update of what's happening in the world and on the roads of Singapore. Stay with us. A very good morning.
In the know, on the go. 938 Now. The Breakfast Club with Keith D'Souza.
Yes, we're back into The Breakfast Club speaking with Julian de Salisbury. He is the managing director and founder of Galen Growth Asia, in town for the HealthTech CEO Summit, and is happening on Friday, the 17th of November. We are talking about the role of startups in Singapore. Julian, welcome back into the program. Earlier you were talking about healthcare inefficiencies in the region. Could you tell us a little bit more on how this perhaps could be addressed by what's happening in health tech?
Absolutely, and it's a very cool focus for us tomorrow and going forwards. And I'll explain why that is more specifically for Galen Growth Asia. If you look at healthcare expenditure in the region, in each country, it's exceeding in growth GDP growth. So there's a problem there to start with. Sure. Unaffordable, essentially. And if you look at the amount of investment that's gone into healthcare in the region, it's been quite substantial. But yet, if you look at that correlation to the improvement in health outcomes at a population level, we're not seeing the correlation.
Right.
So there's obviously an inefficiency there. You're not seeing that translation of dollar invested into actually improved health. So we at Galen Growth Asia spent quite some time this year doing some primary analysis, talking to healthcare professionals, industry and non-industry, to understand what those inefficiencies are, those pain points.
Is it the bureaucratic process?
It's a number of things, absolutely. What we concluded is that you can actually regroup all those into 6 key categories, which are applicable to every single country. It's just the level of impact or severity in each country will vary. Of course, a mature system is different to a developing system. So those 6 areas mean that we can start having a feel for how does a health technology or solution actually solve those. Right. Why it's important is, and the reason for our core topic tomorrow at the CEO Summit is that we believe that you should focus on that problem first, then bring the technology to bear, not the other way around. Otherwise, you're trying to find a problem for a piece of technology, which is often dangerous.
Help me wrap my head around this. You talked about 6 key areas. Let's talk about one.
Okay, let's talk about, say, human capital as an issue.
Okay.
Now, it's a very jargoned term.
Okay,
but
that means manpower.
Exactly, yes. So let me give you an example. In India, for example, the density, let's say, of healthcare professionals, physicians, compared to, say, an OECD country such as Singapore or France or Australia, means that by calculation, you'll probably found it's going to take something like 85 to 100 years for India to catch up.
Wow.
Because there aren't enough healthcare professionals. Now, you could wait 85 to 100 years to try and solve that problem, but you can imagine that problem continues to compound over those 85 years. But now we have technology. You could then start looking at solving that problem by either reaching out to a healthcare professional in another part of the country to find a solution, or in another country. Right. We already have medical tourism with people flying to another country to get us an operation.
A nose job.
Well, a nose job or something like...
something more serious.
Correct, yes. But the technologies such as, say, WebRTC or Skype, those type of technologies allow that to start happening. And of course, now we all have a phone. It's very easy for us to actually start interacting with a doctor somewhere else.
I'd like to follow up with that.
Sure.
If I am getting a diagnosis or a consultation with someone out of the country and I find myself afflicted by a condition, where do I go? If I'm in a resident of a particular country in this part of the world and I'm not particularly well served by a healthcare professional, if that's the case, where do I seek treatment?
It's a very good question. And so one of the things that we do need to be conscious of is that bringing a single solution, such as, for example, allowing a patient to talk to a doctor via a, let's say, a mobile phone, Skype, FaceTime, etc., is insufficient. You need to be able to provide a full service, which says, okay, now you've been diagnosed. How do you then, say, get your medication? Or how do you seek more professional treatment with a specialist, for example? So the business model that particular venture brings to the table needs to be more comprehensive to ensure that the patient has that follow-on or follow-up.
Sure. And in the differing levels of development in the region, I can get the free Skype call, I can get the free FaceTime call. I may not be able to afford the follow-up and perhaps the treatment.
You're absolutely right. And that is a major issue for a lot of developing Asia. I mean, a lot of population in India and Indonesia fall into financial distress simply because they're trying to seek treatment. So one of the pieces in terms of inefficiencies that we were talking about a few minutes ago is what we call capital issues.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily about the fact that we're not investing enough in, say, hospitals. It's also around the mechanisms are not there to allow people to afford. What we're seeing, though, is that interesting overlap between fintech, the financial tech side, and health tech in terms of developing solutions that allow people to start paying differently. Right. The interesting thing is that lately I've had some very interesting conversations with some of the larger organizations that manufacture some of these solutions, say a big drug firm, who are actively seeking to understand how they can leverage some of these new payment mechanisms to allow better affordability mechanism for individuals. A lot of the, let's say, the bottom half of the income pyramid have cash flow issues. In other words, they're trying to manage their cash flow on a day-to-day basis rather than on a monthly basis, as we're all very accustomed to. And therefore, how do you change the payment for a patient that can only pay for something on a day-to-day basis? It's a critical part of trying to improve that. Technology allows that, as we know from paying things on our phone. You know, why can't we pay for our medication on a day-to-day basis on our phone?
Perhaps you talked about human capital and one of the inefficiencies of the whole system. What about the porousness of borders these days? Is the lack of medical professionals in a particular region suffering or being affected by the porousness of borders these days, and these professionals gravitate to where they're actually needed, perhaps in more developed countries?
Yes and no. So logically, yes, you'd see there's a need, and therefore there should be a migration. But then you have, of course, the local environment stands in the way in terms of, say, the regulations. So, you know, you take Indonesia as an example. Indonesia has a substantial prevalence of hepatitis. And so hepatitis C, which is the most chronic of hepatitis disease, I think 6% of the population roughly have that disease. But last time I looked, there was something like 8 hepatologists in Indonesia. So logically, you'd dictate that you'd see this sort of, you know, need being met. But the local rules of the country state that you have to be licensed in that country to practice as a physician. You need to be able to speak the local Bahasa language as well. So there are a number of obstacles, I guess, to that natural migration, which hopefully can be overcome by the technology. But you raise a good point, which is government and regulators need to play their role.
Speaking this morning with Julian de Salisbury, he is the managing director and founder of Galen Growth Asia. We're talking about health tech this morning. When we come back in the moments that we have left on the Breakfast Club, we'll talk about the role of startups in Singapore and how we're faring healthcare-wise or health tech-wise. Keep it right here on 938 Now, hoping to keep you in the know and on the go. Stay with us. Good morning.
The Breakfast Club with Keith D'Souza.
We are talking health tech this morning with Julian de Salisbury. He is the managing director and founder of Galen Growth Asia. Julian, welcome back. In the final moments, we want to talk about startups in Singapore. Have they stepped up to the mark, perhaps?
Singapore actually punches above its weight. It's quite interesting to see. So I mentioned before that we've identified some 3,000 plus health tech ventures across the region. Probably fair to say about 12% of those 3,000 either reside in or operate out of Singapore. And that's not necessarily surprising when you think about the Singapore government's in deliberate investment in healthcare for the last 3 or 4 decades, which means that the platform is there for innovators to be able to develop and grow their prototypes. But also the economic climate, the regulatory stability and legal stability of the country mean that it's very attractive to investors as well as to startups with intellectual property to actually come and locate themselves here. So we're seeing a very rich ecosystem or community of startups.
Just down the road here, I think.
Down the road here, but actually all over. It's interesting that Fusionopolis, for example, doesn't necessarily regroup the health tech startups. That's the beauty of health tech, which is being technology. You can actually be based anywhere. You don't need a laboratory necessarily to do your research. So when you look at, for example, our population of HealthTech CEOs tomorrow, a fairly good size of that population of prominent startups are actually Singapore-based.
So what are we seeing coming out of the Singapore ecosystem?
We're seeing some very interesting developments around data and analytics. So how to use the data that you and I would generate through, say, some of the biosensors, such as the watch you're wearing, those kind of things, to be able to start managing our chronic disease better. And, none more so than, for example, diabetes. We know that last year, I think, the Minister of Health declared war on diabetes.
Indeed.
Diabetes, once you have diabetes, it's one issue, but you really should be addressing the pre-diabetics, those people who are at risk of diabetes.
On the borderlines.
Correct, yeah, before they become diabetic. And so that's where some of these applications that we use become very useful in terms of managing diet, managing lifestyle, managing the way we approach a disease. But the data and analytics behind it is where the power comes into it in terms of helping me change my behaviors.
The technology is there. I'm glad you brought up the behavioral part of it. How receptive are people to actually using this technology to change their lifestyles?
They are receptive, and it's growing in attraction to the everyday person in the street. But like any new technology,
Indeed.
I guess you're seeing your early adopters who have embraced it and are running with it, and of course are allowing some of these exciting startups to refine and define and iterate what their product is. And then you get the followers, really, who are now starting to make more decisive decisions in relation to their own health. We'll always have our laggards who will eventually come on board.
And we hope we will be able to convince them. And if they don't, at least this HealthTech CEO Summit, which is happening on the 17th of November, which is today, actually. We are speaking this morning, or were speaking this morning, with Galen de Salisbury. He is the managing director and founder of Galen Growth Asia. In the moments that we have left, what does the summit hope to achieve?
Deliberate intent is to create much better co-creation and collaboration between the important stakeholders in the ecosystem. In other words, how do we bring all of these innovators together to work together and to find solutions to the problems, the pain points, the inefficiencies we talked about earlier on?
Galen de Salisbury is the managing director and founder of Galen Growth Asia, and we were talking about addressing inefficiencies and a whole lot more this morning on The Breakfast Club. News is coming up. Stay with us. So very good morning.